Hello and welcome back to Physiology 141. This is Ross Langston, and here we're with our second lecture on the central nervous system. This lecture is going to look at the spinal cord. Now just remember that the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and the central nervous system is sort of one of two major areas of the nervous system that we have. Central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. This is where integration takes place. This is where most of the cell bodies of our neurons are located. But on the other hand, we have something else called the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, are all the nerves that extend outside the brain or the spinal cord. And it has a sensory division and a motor division. So the sensory information comes through the sensory division. This information comes from things like touch receptors, visual receptors, the auditory receptors we have in our ear, and they report into the spinal cord and the brain, where that information is processed and integrated, and the brain may choose to initiate some kind of motor output, and that's through the motor division. The motor division, we have nerve impulses traveling out of the spinal cord, what we call efferent motor impulses, and they either go to the somatic division or the autonomic or enteric divisions. So the somatic division basically handles voluntary muscle contraction. So anytime that you move your biceps, your triceps, all of that is from the somatic motor division. On the other hand, the autonomic division controls things that are not voluntarily controlled. For example, salivation or something like that, or sweat glands. So that's part of our autonomic division. And finally, there's actually another division that some textbooks consider called the enteric division, which again operates independently, and this enteric division is in charge of the motility and secretions of your GI tract for your gut. But in essence, it operates similarly to the autonomic division, so we're just going to consider it part of the ANS. Okay, so functions of the spinal cord. First of all, it helps to conduct nerve impulses from the skin and from the other sensory receptors into the body. It is also the site of integration for nervous information, so excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. That's what those words stand for. So depending on the sensory information coming in, your central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, may initiate an appropriate motor output. And sometimes these motor outputs are called reflexes because they happen automatically. Okay, before we get there, we're going to talk about the coverings of the spinal cord and the spinal cord general anatomy. So first of all, let's start out with the meninges. The meninges are a layer of 3 tissues that surround the spinal cord, and each of these has a name like dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid mater. Just be aware that that mater is not a typo. That's actually how it's spelled. It doesn't mean matter, but it means mother. So dura mother is a tough mother of connective tissue that covers the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord included. So let's take a look here at some imagery. So here you can see a slide that shows the spine, and the spine is sitting in the musculature of the back right here. Right here would be your sirloin steaks or your longissimus muscles. Here's your spinous process extending into the skin of the back. Here's your transverse processes. And then underneath all of that, we see our vertebral canal or vertebral foramen. Okay, that is the hollow place where our spinal cord resides. It's very protected in there. Okay, underneath that, you're going to see our meninges. So the first meninges you're going to see right here is something called the dura mater. Remember, dura means tough. It's fibrous connective tissue. It's very protective in there. And then after that, we have something called the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is actually adhering to the underside of the dura mater. It's all essentially one layer. They're hard to separate. So those are the first 2 layers there. And then we have something called pia mater, and the pia mater itself is going to be surrounding the spinal cord. It's basically like wet tissue. It feels like part of the spinal cord. Very, very delicate. Okay, so there you can see where the pia mater might reside. Then we have something called denticulate ligaments. These are just little ligaments that help to hold the spinal cord inside the vertebral canal there. And finally, epidural space. This is important because the epidural space is the potential space in the spine which is on top of the dura mater, and we'll talk about why the epidural space is medically important in just a couple slides. And then we have something called the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid is underneath the dura mater, underneath the arachnoid mater, and it's this area that is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, which is both an ionic and hydrostatic buffer for the spinal cord. And we'll talk about why that's important here in just a minute. So first of all, you've heard of something called a spinal tap. A spinal tap involves actually withdrawing some of that cerebral spinal fluid. In order to do that, we need to stick a needle through the dura mater and also through the arachnoid mater to get to that subarachnoid space of the spinal cord. Why would we do this? Well, first of all, we're looking usually for pressure or infection. In some cases, if we have a child with hydrocephalus or something like that, and the head starts to expand, it's going to cause greater than normal cerebral spinal fluid pressure, which we want to relieve. So we want to be able to sense the pressure in there. But the primary reason we would do a spinal tap is to look for infection. Things like meningitis, we can have bacterial or fungal or even viral meningitis that causes inflammation in meninges and can be very, very deadly if not treated properly. So in order to see if we have bacterial meningitis, we have to go in there and do a puncture into the subarachnoid space, withdraw some of that fluid, and then take a look at it under the microscope. Now, it sounds very, very dangerous, but in actuality it's not. This bottom picture I show what it would look like if we were creating a spinal tap in the area where there's a lot of spinal cord proper. But this is not how we usually do it. In all truth, the spinal cord extends down to, I think, L1, L2, and beyond that we just have little nervelets that extend down into lower sacral and lumbar vertebrae. And so we can make a puncture there and withdraw cerebral spinal fluid with a very low risk to the spinal cord or the spinal nerves. Okay, another common procedure you're here in conjunction with the spinal cord and the meninges is something called an epidural anesthesia. Epidural refers to being on top of the dura mater, and anesthesia, of course, causes numbness or paresis in that area. So this is a procedure we would use, for example, if you're giving birth and you don't want to feel all that pain. Again, we go down in an area of the spinal cord where the spinal cord's already ended, so we're down towards the cauda equina region. We take a catheter, we thread it through the vertebrae, presumably in the side of one of the intervertebral foramina. And the important part here is they are not piercing any of the meninges. In fact, they're just going on top of the dura mater, and there's a little fatty area right there, and they're injecting that anesthetic into the epidural space. And that anesthetic basically makes its round to the nerve. It makes its way around to the nerve roots and causes a localized anesthesia just in that area. So again, it's a pretty safe procedure as long as it's done by skilled personnel. Okay, let's talk about the anatomy of the spinal cord. So first of all, some of you are going to get to hopefully go down to the John Burden School of Medicine and work with the cadavers at some point. Now, when you do, you probably will not be very excited about the spinal cord. I always thought the spinal cord is going to be this magnificent structure in the body once you get the spine opened up. But in truth, when I did my cadaver dissection, the spinal cord was about the diameter of a pinky, so it was kind of unimpressive. Whereas the sciatic nerve, which comes off the spinal cord, is about the diameter of the thumb and is quite impressive. But that being said, the spinal cord does have two key enlargements that you should know about. One is called the cervical enlargement, and the other one called the lumbar enlargement. Now, generally these enlargements are happening in conjunction with the limbs that they're going to be serving. The cervical enlargement is going to have nervelets coming off that are going to feed the pectoral girdle and the upper arms, and then the lumbar enlargement is going to have nerves obviously coming off that feed the legs, the musculature of the legs, the knees, hips, etc. So that's why we have so much thicker of a spinal cord there. Other structures you need to know about in the spinal cord, one is called the conus medullaris. Here you can see this is where the spinal cord tapers to a point at about L2, so that's L1, L2, 3, 4, 5. So the spinal cord doesn't extend all the way down to L5. We just have this terminal filament that goes down this way. But what we have coming out of it is something called the cauda equina. Now, cauda equina is basically the horse's tail, and here's a picture of it right here. We call it cauda equina because it does look like a horse's tail. But basically, these are the nerve roots that extend down past the spinal cord and exit out of foramina in between these different vertebrae right here. So it's at the inferior end of the spinal cord and exits out the sacral and lumbar regions and so forth. Okay, next week or in a week or two, we're going to talk about the different spinal nerves. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of spinal nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical ones, 5 lumbar ones, 12 thoracic ones, 5 sacral, and 1 pair of coccygeal. And we'll learn what each one of these do. But for the most part, these nerves are what we call mixed nerves. That is, they have axons of both sensory neurons and motor neurons. So let's look a little bit at some spinal cord anatomy. So first of all, when you look at the spinal cord, you notice that it has nerves that connect up with it. So this is a nerve, and the nerve, remember, is just a bundle of axons surrounded by connective tissues. And spinal nerves are mixed nerves. The nerve contains both sensory axons, which are carrying information in, and motor axons, which are carrying information out. Now, once we get to the spinal cord, we branch off into either a dorsal root or a ventral root. The dorsal root just carries the sensory axons, and those sensory axons travel in to the posterior gray horns where they synapse with other neurons. Now, the important thing about the sensory neurons is they have their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies located just outside the central nervous system, and this ganglion is where our cell bodies of our sensory neurons are located. All the other neurons are going to have their cell bodies in the spinal cord, for example, our motor neurons, or our interneurons. The whole neuron is in there as well, so there's no interneurons to see right now. But big picture is the spinal nerve comes in, dorsal root connects the sensory information up to the posterior horns of the spinal cord. On the other hand, the ventral root is where the axons for the motor neurons are located. And remember, the motor neurons are carrying information away from the spinal cord, so they're carrying their information out. We call these efferent neurons. And the cell bodies for these motor neurons, if they're somatic motor neurons, are going to be within the anterior gray horns, which is right here. Now, in addition to having sensory information going in and motor information going out, the spinal cord is a very important region for integration and processing. And the area where integration and processing happens is the gray matter. Remember when we said the brain, the gray matter was on the outside in the cortex, but in the spinal cord, the gray matter is reversed. It's on the inside in what we call the horns. And so the gray matter is here in what we call the posterior or dorsal horns, or anterior or ventral horns, and sometimes there's a lateral horn, which we don't see here. But big picture is gray matter is where we have cell bodies and synapses and junctions between different neurons. On the other hand, all this white matter on the outside are simply myelinated and non-myelinated axons that are running to and fro. Think of it as being the cabling between large junctions where we have processors. The processors are the gray matter, and the white matter here is basically just the wiring. Okay, let's look at the gray matter of the spinal cord. So again, we have posterior gray horns. These are the areas where we have the sensory information coming in from our dorsal root, and we might have interneurons up in here as well. Okay, and then on our anterior gray horns, this is where our cell bodies of our somatic motor neurons are located. So when your biceps or triceps contracts, the cell bodies that control them are located right here in our anterior gray horns. Now, in other areas of the spinal cord, there might be a lateral horn. There's actually not one here, but there would be right about here. And that lateral horn would contain the cell bodies of autonomic motor nuclei. And we'll talk about those later in a couple more chapters. Okay, the white matter is not central processing. The white matter, remember, are just myelinated axons that are running either up the spinal cord towards the brain or down the spinal cord towards the effector organs. And the white matter is essentially transmitting information to and fro. Okay, in your textbook, they do go into quite a bit of detail talking about the names for this white matter. Now, white matter in bundles in the peripheral nervous system would be called nerves, but in the central nervous system, we call it tracts. So tracts are simply bundles of axons within the central nervous system. We have sensory tracts, which are ascending, going up towards the brain, and motor tracts, which are descending, going down towards the effector organs. Again, if you look in the textbook, they might have some pretty funky jargon for this stuff. I think they call them funiculi and things like this. But for the purpose of lecture, we just need to know the difference between gray matter and white matter, and know that some of the white matter is carrying sensory information and some is carrying motor information. Now, the gray matter we said before is the integration center, central nervous system, and in the spinal cord, that gray matter is found in our horns. And some of this information coming in can result in an automatic, sort of predictable reflex. A reflex is a fast, predictable, automatic response in result to changes in the environment. Probably one of the reflexes you're familiar with is when they go to the doctor's office and they hit your little your knee with that hammer, that reflex hammer, and it causes your quadriceps muscle to contract and your knee kicks out a little bit. So we're going to talk about how reflexes work. So examples of reflexes are something like the withdrawal reflex, putting your hand on a hot plate and going, ow, that's hot, pulling it away. The knee jerk reflex, which was involved the knee popping out in result to being stimulated with a hammer. And then there's something called a visual tracking reflex. And this actually was a hot topic about 10 years ago when there was a landmark court case about a woman that was in a persistent vegetative state. Her name was Terry Schiavo. And basically, because of other medical reasons, she was essentially, for all intents and purposes, brain dead, or cerebral dead anyway. She had no activity up in the upper regions of her brain where thought and intellect take place. Yet her parents would say, you know, when we run a balloon across the room, she'll track it with her eyes. And they were saying, hey, this is a indication that she's there, she's present. But as it turns out, this is a very rudimentary reflexive reflex that's called a cranial reflex that happens when basically nothing else is running on in the brain. And so as a result of the court case, I believe her husband eventually won and she was allowed to pass away. All right, so let's talk about some reflex arcs here. And first of all reflexes start with some sensory information coming in. So this sensory information in this case could just be a pin that's stuck in your hand or your foot. Okay, sensory neurons take that information, travels up the dorsal root into the spinal cord where it synapses within the posterior horns with either an interneuron or a motor neuron. And once we go from there, we have integration going on as we talk to those different neurons. And that integration might result in a motor response. If it does, that's probably going to go out our anterior gray horn. This is where our somatic motor neuron cell bodies are located. And then that neuron, axon, will travel out our ventral root through our spinal cord to the muscle. Let's say if this is our hand, this might be our biceps brachii muscle that help pull our finger off that tack or the sharp piece of glass or whatever. So a reflex involves sensory information going in and motor information going out. Okay, before we can talk about reflexes, we need to be able to categorize these in two different ways. The first way we need to be able to categorize them is based on how many synapses are involved. If you remember, a synapse is an area where one cell talks to another cell, and it involves an axon here and dendrites there. Okay, so if we have a monosynaptic reflex arc, we're talking about one cell talking to one other cell. So if we look in here, this blue neuron right here, this would be a sensory axon, information coming in. And in this particular reflex, we're talking to a single motor neuron, information going out. Because it's only two cells, there's only one synapse. So this is called monosynaptic. On the other hand, we could look at a different version where we have a sensory neuron coming in. It talks to an interneuron. So already we have one synapse here. And then that motor neuron talks to, that interneuron talks to a motor neuron. There's a second synapse. So because there's two synapses, we call that polysynaptic. Okay, the next question is, what happens to the motor outputs? Are they on the same side of the spinal cord as the sensory information, or are they on a different side? So the real simple reflexes involve what we call ipsilateral contraction or ipsilateral reflexes. That is, sensory information comes in, say one side of the spinal cord, up our dorsal root, and then motor information goes out the same route. So when I put my hand on a hot plate and I pull up that hand, sensory information came up my right hand to my spinal cord, and then the motor information goes from my spinal cord to my biceps muscle, says pull your hand away. So that would be ipsilateral. On the other hand, contralateral involves movement on the opposite side of the spinal cord from which the stimulus came in. And we're going to see some examples here in a minute, but one of the most common ones is the crossed extensor reflex, which we'll talk about here in a second. Okay, so first of all, we're going to talk about something called the patellar stretch reflex. You've had this done at the doctor's office probably countless numbers of times, and probably as a child you always wondered, why the heck are they doing this? Why do they care so much about my knee? They don't. They're actually trying to figure out whether your central nervous system and peripheral nervous system are communicating effectively. So here's what they do. Basically, they strike your patellar ligament, which is connective tissue between your patella and your tibial tuberosity. They strike that with a small reflex hammer. Now, there are stretch receptors in the tendon and in the ligament itself that detect when it's being pressed too much, or too much pressure, too much stretch. And so it sends that information via sensory neurons all the way up, okay, to our spinal cord via the dorsal root into our posterior gray horns, where that information is relayed to motor neurons and interneurons, etc. So in this way, it involves sensory information going up the same side. And one of the things that's going to happen is that motor information will come out that very same side, and it will tell your quadriceps muscles to contract. Now, when the quadriceps contracts, it pulls the stress off of that patellar ligament. It basically decompresses it so it's not stretched so much. And this is the whole purpose of this reflex, is to prevent the patellar ligament from tearing, because that would be very, very bad. So in that sense, this single reflex right here would be monosynaptic because it only involved a sensory neuron talking to a motor neuron. So monosynaptic, and that would be ipsilateral because the sensory information and motor information came and left on the same side of the spinal cord, right? We stimulated, in this case, let's say the right knee, and that caused the quadriceps muscle on the right leg to contract. So that would be ipsilateral. And again, because only one neuron was involved, this particular aspect of the reflex would be called monosynaptic. However, realize that all muscles have antagonists, right? So the quadriceps are responsible for extending the knee, but they are antagonized or have opposite muscles called the hamstrings. And the hamstrings are responsible for flexing the knee. If the extensor muscles, the knee extensor muscles, are to work effectively, we have to tell the knee flexor muscles to be quiet for a minute. So what happens here is part of this reflex is this sensory neuron talks to an interneuron, which talks to a motor neuron, and in that case it tells the muscles and my hamstrings to relax so that my quadriceps can contract. And because this involves 3 different neurons and 2 synapses, we call this a polysynaptic reflex, just when referring to the reciprocal inhibition that goes on here. Okay, this is just a reminder for me to send you a picture or a video of a patellar stretch reflex. You've probably seen them a lot. They're pretty boring, but what you haven't seen is when they go wrong. They're kind of fascinating. So I will send you that video along with this, this video as well. Okay, now we're going to talk about some more complicated reflexes, for example, the crossed extensor reflex. So let's take a look here. So the flexor reflex was basically what we talked about before. The example was the patellar tendon reflex. We strike it, we get contraction of the quadriceps muscles, relaxation of the hamstrings, and it happens on the same side of the spinal cord, so we call that ipsilateral. Now, let's talk about crossed extensor. Crossed extensor involves some crossing over of nerve impulses. So I want you to imagine that you are on the beach and you've just been working out, you're feeling really buff, you got your best swimsuit on, you're walking around, you're looking at guys or girls or what have you, and you're like, how you doing? And you're not paying attention, and so you step on a broken beer bottle. You step on that broken beer bottle, let's say with your left foot. Okay, your left foot goes on the broken beer bottle. Ow, that hurts. So sensory information travels up your left leg, goes up the dorsal root into the spinal cord. It synapses here with interneurons and with motor neurons. So already we have 1, 2 synapses, whoops, and motor information is coming out on the same side of the spinal cord. So in this aspect, it is just ipsilateral because it's telling my hamstrings not to contract, my quadriceps is going to contract. But I also have to talk about what else is going on, because if you've just stepped on this bottle with your left leg, you want to pull your left leg away from the broken bottle. But before you can do that, you have to stabilize yourself with your right leg. So one of the things that's going to happen is we have a crossing over, a interneuron that's here crossing over the H part into this other gray horn, and that's controlling the quadriceps muscles of the opposite leg. So it's going to tell the leg that's not injured to extend itself so that I can put my ankle down and get a firm footing on the sand before I pull up my injured leg. Because if I pull up my injured leg before my uninjured leg has become extended, I'm going to have more problems than just a hole in my foot. I'm going to have a hole in my face. So this is what goes on with crossed extensor reflexes. It involves information coming in the left side of the spinal cord, information goes out the left side, but it also goes out the right side, right? We have to stabilize our right foot, which is uninjured, before we pick up our left foot, which is injured. And that's why it's called the crossed extensor reflex. So when it comes to exam time, you should be able to identify all these different areas of the spinal cord, tell me what's going on in the gray matter and the white matter, but also be able to identify reflexes and call them monosynaptic or polysynaptic, ipsilateral or contralateral, based on the number of synapses and also based on whether or not they cross over. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'll be back with you soon.